Spirit is thus posited in the third element in universal self-consciousness. It is its community. The movement of the community as self-consciousness that has distinguished itself from its picture thought is to make explicit what has been implicitly established. The dead, divine, man, or human God is in himself the universal self-consciousness. This he has to become explicitly for this self-consciousness. Or, since this self-consciousness constitutes one side of the antithesis in picture thought, that is, the side of evil for which natural existence and individual self-consciousness count as essence, this side, which is pictured as independent, not yet as a moment, has, on account of its independence, to raise itself through its own nature to spirit. That is, it has to exhibit in its own self the movement of spirit. Paragraph 781 is fairly short, particularly as we're coming off the massive paragraph 780, and it begins with a reference to what's going on in paragraph 780. We get this: Spirit is thus posited, gazetted, set down in the third element, and the term there is elementa, so it's just a cognate. Hegel's deliberately using that. And we could say, well, what is this third element? The Spirit is being placed, being put into this, well, he tells us, in universal self-consciousness, and this is really where we're going for the rest of the religion section. Allgemeines Selbstbewusstsein. Right, so self-consciousness has been something absolutely central throughout the work since the self-consciousness section. Very important for the religion section, as we know from the very beginning of the religion section onward. And then we have it being universal. Universal as opposed to what? Particular, Einzelness, as we're going to talk about. The singular or single consciousness of the, as we're going to talk about it here, the human God, the person of Jesus Christ in Christianity. And so how is Spirit going to be put down? How is Spirit going to be established, gazetted in this third element of self-consciousness, universal self-consciousness? Well, there's a lot of twists and turns to it. And the first one, which no big surprise here, it's community. Hegel has been talking about community for quite a long time in the religion section. And if you've been reading ahead, you know that the community is going to be where this religious self-consciousness, the universal self-consciousness, is actually not just taking place, but where it is working itself out. So, a lot going on here. He says, the movement of the community as self-consciousness. And really, we've got two distinct, we could call them movements if we want, that are paralleling each other when it comes to this universal self-consciousness. We've got the movement within the community, the Bewegung, right? Going somewhere, and this is going to be a transition from the in itself or implicit to something that is more reflective, as we're going to see. And then we have the other side of it. We could call this the object, but it's also a subject that is being taken on, the dead divine man or human God. So this movement has to be understood in this way. And then we're going to be trying to get away, unsuccessfully at this point, from picture thinking or from imagination, from representation, however you want to translate Vorstellung. So he says the movement of the community of self-consciousness that has distinguished itself, set itself apart from its picture thought, right? So going back a little bit further, not just in 780, but before that, we've got this dialectic taking place within the community, the religious community. Religion is working through Vorstellungen, right? Through images, representations. These could be verbal. These could also be, you could say, encapsulated in rituals and in action. But it's also at the same time transcending that reflectively, spiritually. There's going to be a more there, and this more had better not just be some sort of airy-fairy mysticism or good feeling. It really needs to be something that is communicable, but in a mode that goes beyond Vorstellung. So, coming back to the text, he says, the movement of the community as self-consciousness that has distinguished itself from its picture thought is to make explicit, hervorzubringen, to bring in front of us or bring in front of its members what was only implicitly established, an sich, right? So an sich is often translated as implicitly, makes good sense. The an sich needs to be brought to the for something. And now here, implicitly established, an sich geworden ist. So established, yes, but really more like what has become, what has taken place behind the scenes without us realizing it. So there's something, and this is again looking forward again, something very important. What has been only implicitly done now needs to be explicitly done. And what is he going to talk about next? The dead divine man or human God, the gottliche Mensch, the menschliche Gott. Notice the chiasm there, the sort of X thing going on. And this is worth dwelling on. So divine man, gottliche Mensch, right? We have human being, the humanity as what has divinity predicated of it. And then in the other case, we have God as, or the divinity, as what has humanity predicated of it. And these can't just be predicates and subjects that are sort of separate from each other. They have to interpenetrate each other in Christ. And we've talked about this quite a bit already. But now this needs to be for the community. He says that the dead divine man or God is in himself the universal self-consciousness, in himself, an sich, right? And that needs to be made explicit now for this self-consciousness. What self-consciousness? The universal self-consciousness, which is both that of the divine man. The divine man needs to realize himself, even in his death, as this universal self-consciousness, but it needs to be in, for, through, carried on by the community. After this person's death, even if there is a resurrection, it has to be continued on after he exits the scene. A church has to be established. A community has to be established. So he goes on and he says, since this self-consciousness constitutes one side of the antithesis in picture thought, right? So now we've got picture thinking going on, and lots of discussion of that in the previous paragraphs. One side of the antithesis. The antithesis, in this case, is literally a contradiction, a Gegensatz, right? The strongest form of being opposed that we could have. It's not just entgegengesetzt, it's, Gegensatz, right? And what is this polarity? What is this side of the antithesis? The side of evil, of böse, for which, he says, natural existence, so natürliches Dasein, and individual self-consciousness. Now, this is interesting because it is einzelne, individual, but it's not actually self-consciousness as the term there. It's für sich sein, which, is that distinct from or different from self-consciousness? I mean, self-consciousness is being for itself, für sich sein, being in relation to another, reflecting on oneself. So it's not a bad fit, but it is a curious translation choice. And then he says that these, natural existence and individual self-consciousness, count as essence, as Wesen, as that which is centrally important, right? Then he goes on and he says, this side which is pictured as independent, selbstständige, not yet a moment, has on account of the independence, this state of being independent, Selbstständigkeit, to raise itself through its own nature to spirit. It has to establish in its own self the movement of spirit. And, the movement of spirit, this spirit posited in the third element, is the community. So we have to have a movement from the individual self-consciousness, a self-consciousness which could be that of the dead divine man or could be that of any individual worshiper or community member, into the community, understanding oneself not as lost in a community, but as an individual within a community. So that's what's going on here in paragraph 781. This self-consciousness is natural spirit. The self has to withdraw from this natural existence and retreat into itself, which would mean to become evil. But this side is already in itself evil. Its withdrawal into itself consists therefore in convincing itself that natural existence is evil. For the consciousness that thinks in pictures, the world has actually become and is evil, and the propitiation of the absolute being was a real event. But in self-consciousness as such, what is thus pictured as happening as an event has, as regards its form, the significance only of a suspended moment. For the self is the negative and hence a knowing that is a pure act within consciousness itself. This moment of the negative must likewise express itself in the content. That is to say, since absolute being is already reconciled with itself in itself and is a spiritual unity in which the parts of the picture thought are suspended or are moments, what is expressed in the content is that each part of the picture thought here receives the opposite meaning to what it had before. Each meaning thereby completes itself in the other, and only through this self-completion is the content a spiritual one. Since the determinateness is just as much its opposite, unity and otherness, that is, the spiritual relationship is an accomplished fact. Just as the opposite meanings were united previously for us or in themselves, and even the abstract forms of the same and not the same, of identity and non-identity, were reduced to moments. Paragraph 782 is going to follow up on the key distinction that Hegel's making in this religion section between the form of picture thinking and the way that the self-consciousness understands itself through that, and the, let's call it, true perspective or truer perspective of absolute being, absolute Wesen in this case. So, what is the absolute being? If we're looking back at the previous paragraph, it's going to be this universal self-consciousness, which we find in the dead God-man and in the community. And how do we get the individual reincorporated into that? That is going to be the key to this movement. So he says what we're talking about here is natural spirit, Geist, in the natürliche form, right? Or we could say understood in this perspective. So what is going on with this? We've got natural existence, Natürlichkeit. It's not natürliches Dasein or anything like that, but the state of being a natural thing, something that is in the world. As we're going to see, a world that turns out to be construed as evil. And so the movement of this natural spirit at this place, he says the self, the Selbst, has to do two things. It has to withdraw from this natural existence, and it's a little bit more active than just withdrawing. Sich zurück zu ziehen, right? So zurück means back to, or going backwards in a certain way, and then ziehen, to draw, to pull itself out of this natural existence. And what we're going to see is there's really two different kinds of natural existence being thought of here in this. And then what else is it supposed to do? To retreat into itself, in sich zu gehen. Now this in sich gehen, we have encountered this before in this section, right? So that is hearkening back to all of those paragraphs, and we should be thinking of that movement as well. So the self withdraws itself from a, let's call it, merely natural existence, but it doesn't withdraw itself completely from natural existence. We could say there's natural existence, lowercase n, and then there's natural existence, let's call it n squared, right? And this is still something bad. So the attempt to go into itself away from its, let's call it, animal existence into a distinctively human, individualized existence marks it as evil, as böse, right? So he says this side is already in itself evil, right? So we've got two sides here, natural existence, the self, and the self has now made itself more evil. Its withdrawal into itself, he says, consists in convincing itself, überzeugen, right, to tell itself, to construct a narrative in which it itself, its natural existence, is evil. And then he says, for the consciousness that thinks in pictures. So now we're not just talking about the individual, but a horizon, a perspective. The consciousness that thinks in pictures, the world has actually become and is evil. And so it thinks of the propitiation of the divine being. What propitiation are we talking about here? A sacrifice to make things right. Okay, what sacrifice is that? The incarnation, and then the torture and death, and in effect the social destruction of this Jesus, human God person, right? So that is supposed to make things right, but does it really make things right? He says the world has become evil. The propitiation was a real event. It's being pictured as a real event. And now Hegel is not denying that within history there was an individual named Jesus, recognized as the Christ, the Anointed One, who was crucified, died, was buried, or any of that sort of thing, right? He's not calling that into question and saying, oh, it's just mythology or anything like that. But he's interested in the meaning for history of this event. Is it real in the sense of being the truest story, or is this just interesting picture thinking or representation that we have to unpack? So he says, in self-consciousness as such, in the absolute being, from the perspective of it's not being brought up here, but from the perspective of conceptual thinking within the religious community, as opposed to picture thinking within the religious community, we have self-consciousness as such. He goes on and he says, what is thus pictured as happening as an event, something that's happening, right, has as regards its form the significance only of a suspended moment. So if the forms of picture thinking are suspended moments, this is language that we've seen before, or superseded, because the term there is aufgehobenes. Right, so Aufhebung is taking place here, and these are moments rather than things existing fully with all of their meaning on their own. So he goes on and he says, here we go, the self is the negative, right? And hence a knowing. Now, why would the negative be a knowing? Well, because that's part of how we make sense of things as creatures, as beings that supersede the world and its representational contents, right? So Wissen here, knowing, and the knowing, interestingly, Hegel's going to say, is a pure act, ein reines Tun. Tun is to this acting, right? So this isn't just like a speculative sitting back, contemplating. This is an activity. This is agency as well. And so he goes on and says, this moment of the negative must likewise express itself in the content. And what is that going to mean? Well, he goes on and he says, since absolute being, absolute Wesen, is already reconciled with itself, there is a reconciliation that has taken place in history, in spirit, without us necessarily knowing about it. We might be stuck here in picture thinking, right? But something has been going on, if only implicitly. Now it needs to be brought into explicit, right in front of us, sort of an invitation. Join in the community. He says, the moment of the negative must express itself in the content. Absolute being is reconciled with itself, in itself, and is a spiritual unity in which the parts of the picture thought are suspended or are moments. Okay, so, all of this is not just simply false, but it's not complete. It's, to use a term that Hegel used a lot earlier in the Phenomenology, one-sided, right? And what we need is something that incorporates and sublates all of these moments that otherwise could be isolated against each other and lose their fuller meaning. So he goes on and he says, what is expressed in the content from the absolute perspective, is that each part of the picture thought here receives the opposite or opposed meaning. Entgegengesetzte Bedeutung. Explicitly talking about meaning here, right? A significance is another way of making sense of it. What it should be translated into for us. So every bit of this is connected to some sort of opposed Entgegengesetzt, set in opposition to it, bit of meaning as well. So the self here is opposed to its other in the field of representation. What does that mean? That means that a completion, a Vollendung, can take place for these elements or these aspects or these moments of picture thinking. It doesn't happen in picture thinking. It happens in absolute being, in self-consciousness as such, in knowing that is pure act, in the community as we're proceeding through. So he says each meaning completes itself, or is brought to fruition, is another way of thinking about it, in the other, and only through this self-completion is the content a spiritual, a geistige one, right? That takes the picture thinking and makes it more. It introduces a transcendent surplus to it, which is not going to be found within the picture thinking itself, right? It can only be gestured at by the picture thinking. And he says, since the determinateness, the Bestimmtheit, is just as much its opposite, unity in otherness, the spiritual relationship, is an accomplished fact. Once again, we see Hegel revealing his hand, saying, yeah, this has already happened. Now we need to make it happen for us. And the way that we realize that this is for us is through knowing that is also at the same time an act. We bring ourselves through realization into that community of absolute being, the spiritual community. And so he says, just as the opposite meanings were united previously for us or in themselves. And now notice what he's saying here. This goes back to the previous paragraphs where we realize that these very metaphysical determinations, to use this term, Bestimmtheit again, of the same and not the same, of identity and non-identity, these are themselves moments. Now, we've got two different kinds of, or perhaps even more than two different kinds of picture thinking going on. We've got the picture thinking that plays around with abstract concepts, but is not yet the concept itself, grasping things conceptually. We also have the narrative in religion of the extrication of the self from nature, still remaining within nature, being evil, the world being reconciled to God through the propitiation of the divine being by God himself, becoming incarnate and dying, and all of these things connected together. We could talk about the journey of the self as well. All of these are moments within something that exceeds representation or picture thinking. And it can only happen, interestingly enough, this is where we'll close, not something that Hegel's actually saying at this point, but he has brought this up before. It can only happen within the matrix of a community, not just some isolated thinker going off by themselves, not just some hermit, not just some mystic. It happens through taking what is, has meanings and pictures and images and narratives, and bringing it into a higher level of reason or spirit here in the consummate religion.